Imagine being handed the legal deed to a city,
Okay.
but, you arrive and you find out it is essentially a mass grave
Yeah.
of charred stone.
Right, just total devastation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's completely surrounded by hostile neighbors who, well, they actively want you dead.
Yeah, that is not a great real estate acquisition.
No, it really isn't. And your job in this scenario isn't just to, stack some rocks or clean up the debris. Your job is to literally resurrect a dead nation before it gets wiped off the geopolitical map forever.
And that is exactly what we're looking at when we open the Book of Nehemiah. I mean, we aren't looking at this serene, calculated engineering project with pristine blueprints and laser levels.
Right.
We're looking at a desperate, murky, and incredibly dangerous attempt to rebuild a shattered identity out of literal and spiritual rubble.
It's a profound crisis of survival, really.
It absolutely is, because the rubble they are sifting through in 5th century BC Jerusalem, it isn't merely the physical remnants of a conquered city, it is the physical manifestation of centuries of covenantal infidelity.
Wow. Yeah, they are literally standing in the ash heap of divine discipline.
Exactly.
Which I think sets the stakes perfectly for what we are doing today. If you are joining us for this deep dive, you are likely in the trenches of local church ministry. You might be a first-year MDiv student wrestling with Hebrew paradigms, or you're a serious lay leader tasked with guiding your congregation through the complexities of the Old Testament.
And our mission today is to conduct a rigorous, scripturally grounded survey of the Book of Nehemiah to help you do just that.
Yes, and we are going to live in the primary text today, specifically pulling from the Biblia Hebraica Stichdartensia, the DHS. And we are going to move far, far beyond the standard Sunday school narrative of, Nehemiah built a wall.
Right, because if we reduce this book to a corporate leadership manual or a simple construction diary, we totally strip it of its immense theological weight.
Yeah, we lose the core of it.
We really do. So we are going to trace the historical mechanics of the Persian Restoration, dive into the unique literary structure of this text, and examine its profound canonical integration.
Because our ultimate goal is to see how this administrative logistical record serves as the terminal phase of Old Testament history. It literally sets the stage for the promised Davidic king, Jesus Christ.
That's the trajectory.
So let's ground ourselves historically first. To understand the air Nehemiah is breathing, we have to grasp the trauma that precedes him, the Sitzim Laban, right? The setting in life.
Right, the historical context.
Which is entirely dictated by this massive shift in imperial power from Babylon to Persia. But I kind of want to bypass the standard summary of the exile. I mean, we know Assyria wiped out the north in 722 BC, and Babylon destroyed the south in 586 BC.
Standard historical timeline, yeah.
Right. But what I want to drill into is the mechanical difference of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Why did the Persian imperial policy suddenly decide to legally sanction a Jewish return?
It's a fascinating shift.
Right. What is the machinery behind Cyrus the Great and later Artaxerxes I that makes Nehemiah's mission even possible?
Well, that is the crucial question, really, because the geopolitical shift is breathtaking when you look at it. The Assyrian and Babylonian models of conquest, they were built entirely on assimilation through terror and deportation.
Yeah, just uprooting everyone.
Exactly. They would conquer a people, deport the ruling class to the completely opposite side of the empire, and then replace them with foreigners, all just to break their national identity.
But the Persian model was different.
Radically different. Inaugurated by Cyrus and maintained by his successors like Artaxerxes, it was essentially an empire of subsidized localization.
Subsidized localization.
Yeah.
I like that.
The Persians basically realized that you could extract far more tax revenue and maintain much better border security if you just allowed indigenous peoples to live in their ancestral lands.
Right. Let them stay home.
Let them stay home, worship their ancestral gods, and govern themselves under a local leader who is loyal to the Persian crown.
I mean, I see the geopolitical logic there. It's a decentralized approach to empire building.
Yeah.
You pacify the outer provinces by giving them religious and cultural autonomy, just as long as they pay their tribute.
Exactly.
So for the Jewish people, the decree of Cyrus wasn't just some, spontaneous moment of imperial benevolence.
No, not from a secular historical perspective. From that angle, it was a highly calculated administrative strategy.
Right.
But, and this is key, from the perspective of biblical theology, it is the sovereign providence of Yahweh manipulating the hearts of pagan emperors to fulfill his covenant promises.
Yes. Proverbs 21:1, right? The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will.
Spot on. God utilizes a covenant imperial policy as the literal mechanism to legally sanction the return of the Jewish remnant. She allows them to rebuild the Jerusalem temple and restore the province of Judah, which the Persians called Yehud.
Yehud, right. Which brings us to the actual author of this text and the unique nature of the document itself. When you open the Hebrew text, the opening words are Divrei Nehemiah ben Hakaliah, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah.
Right.
And this immediately signals that we are dealing with something distinct. It is the Nehemiah memoir.
Yeah, it's a first-person, highly autobiographical account, which is rare.
It is. But I want to pause on how we even received this book in the canon, because historically, the Jewish tradition didn't view this as a standalone memoir, did they?
No, they didn't at all. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, Ezra and Nehemiah were viewed as an inseparable, united record.
Really?
Yeah, if you look at the Talmud specifically, in the tractate Baba Batra 15a, they are treated as a single scroll. They tell this complete two-phase story of the restoration.
Okay, so what are the two phases?
So Ezra provides the account of the priestly spiritual restoration. That's the temple and the Torah under Zerubbabel and later Ezra himself. And then Nehemiah provides the necessary counterpart, the civil, administrative, and physical restoration of the city walls and governance.
So if they are a theological unity, how do they get divorced in our modern English Bibles? It kind of feels like we were reading part 2 of a movie without having seen part 1.
That's a good way to put it. That separation was actually a much later development facilitated by the Septuagintal tradition.
The Greek translation.
Exactly, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In the Greek, they were distinguished as Esdras B and Esdras Gamma, and that was largely due to scroll lengths and the distinct first-person shifts in the text.
Right, similar to how Samuel or Kings got divided.
Exactly the same process.
Yeah.
But reading Ezra and Nehemiah as a theological unity is essential for our exegesis here. Together, they document the comprehensive transition from the absolute ruin of the Babylonian exile to a restored, stabilized, and legally protected provincial presence in the Persian Empire.
You know, the distinction between the two men is what I find most fascinating. Because Nehemiah is not a priest like Ezra.
Yeah.
And he is not a prophet operating on the margins like Haggai or Zechariah. The text introduces him as a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes.
Yes.
He is a Persian-appointed civil governor, a Teshatha in the Persian terminology. He is a high-ranking political official operating inside the most powerful bureaucracy on earth.
And that secular administrative background is exactly what shapes the literary structure of the book.
Yeah, it really is.
When you transition from reading the prophets to reading Nehemiah, the rhetorical shift is totally jarring. Nehemiah isn't writing sweeping poetic oracles, right?
Not at all.
He is writing administrative memos, supply chain requests, and architectural assessments.
It's all logistics.
Exactly. He is navigating imperial bureaucracy, requesting letters of transit for safe passage through the satrapy of Ebernari, the province beyond the river. He is requisitioning timber from Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment here, just to push back on that.
Go for it.
Because as a first-year MDiv student reading this, it's really easy to look at the macro structure of this book and feel incredibly underwhelmed spiritually.
Sure.
I mean, you read a chapter like Nehemiah 3, and it is literally just a localized census report. It's a list of names and which specific section of a stone wall they repaired. Why is a logistical diary inspired scripture? It reads more like a politician's ledger than a theological treatise.
It does read like a ledger, but that's because for the post-exilic community, civil administration was a deeply theological act. We really have to recalibrate our modern Greek dualism that separates the spiritual from the secular.
Right, we do that all the time.
Constantly.
Yeah.
But for Nehemiah, securing the physical perimeter of Jerusalem was the strict prerequisite for securing the spiritual integrity of the covenant community. Let's actually look at the Hebrew in that chapter 3 ledger you mentioned.
Yeah, let's look at it.
As you read the list of builders, there is a recurring syntactic formula, el yado. It translates to next to him or literally at his hand.
Al yado. So the text is deliberately emphasizing adjacency, the physical proximity of the builders.
Precisely. And look at who is adjacent to whom. You have Eliashib the high priest building a section of the wall, and al yado next to him are the men of Jericho.
Okay.
Further down, you have Uziel the goldsmith building a section, and al yado Hananiah the perfumer. You have district rulers building right next to temple servants.
Wow, so no class divides there.
None. Nehemiah is using this genealogical and vocational ledger rhetorically. He is demonstrating that covenant faithfulness in this terminal phase of history requires the total unified mobilization of the community, regardless of social stratification. The theology is literally embedded in the logistics.
That drastically changes how you would preach chapter 3. The administrative structure is actually a picture of ecclesiastical unity.
Exactly.
But this unified building project was not happening in a vacuum, right? It was heavily contested. The text pivots immediately into the rhetoric of governance under extreme duress.
Oh, extreme duress.
We see these twin threats that constantly menace the reconstruction. First, we have the external opposition from the surrounding nations, Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab.
And we must recognize the canonical callback happening here. This external opposition is not just random political friction. It actually mirrors the hostile neighbors and the snares that Israel encountered during their very first settlement of the Promised Land under Joshua.
Right.
The surrounding pagan nations recognize that a fortified Jerusalem is a direct threat to their regional influence. Sanballat and Tobiah, they employ every tactic of psychological and asymmetrical warfare you can think of.
Yeah, they mock the structural integrity of the wall.
They threaten military violence, they attempt political subversion, and they even try to lure Nehemiah into an assassination trap.
And Nehemiah's mitigation tactics here are incredibly revealing about his theology of human agency. He doesn't just, pray for God to build the wall miraculously.
No, he prays and then he arms the builders.
Right. Half the men hold spears, bows, and armor, while the other half carry materials. He even keeps a trumpeter standing beside him to sound the alarm. It is this hyper-vigilant readiness for opportunity.
Yeah.
But as gripping as the external threat is, Chapter 5 introduces an internal vulnerability that seems far more catastrophic to the community's survival.
Chapter 5 is the crisis point of the entire memoir. I mean, the external threat of Sanballat was uniting the people, but the internal threat was tearing them apart at the seams.
So what's happening internally?
We see a massive socioeconomic crisis. The region is experiencing a famine. The Persian imperial taxes are exorbitant, and the Jewish people are simply running out of food.
Okay.
To survive, the poorer citizens are mortgaging their fields, their vineyards, and their homes to the wealthy Jewish nobles. And when that isn't enough, they are literally selling their own sons and daughters into debt slavery to their fellow Jews just to buy grain.
Wait, let me stop you there because the mechanics of this are crucial.
Yeah.
They have just been rescued from exile by the grace of God, and the moment things get difficult, the aristocracy begins cannibalizing the working class.
It's horrific.
How exactly did this ancient credit system function that allowed it to get this bad so quickly?
Well, in the ancient Near East, the agricultural economy was incredibly fragile. If you had a crop failure, you had zero safety net. You had to borrow seed grain for the next planting season just to survive.
Right.
The wealthy nobles in Judah were exploiting this desperation by charging exorbitant interest. In Hebrew, the term for this kind of predatory interest is neshek, which literally means to bite.
Wow, to bite. That's visceral.
It is, and it was a direct violation of the clearest covenantal laws in the Torah, specifically Exodus 22 and Leviticus 25, which explicitly forbade charging interest to a fellow Israelite in need. They were treating their covenant brothers like foreign commodities.
So they are surviving the Persian Empire. They are fending off assassination plots from Sanballat, only to economically exploit each other into oblivion. And Nehemiah's reaction to this is explosive. The text says he was very angry. He convenes a great assembly and publicly indicts the nobles, forcing them to immediately cancel the debts and restore the properties. He leverages his administrative authority to demand covenantal equity.
Because Nehemiah understands the canonical history of his people. He knows exactly why God sent the Babylonians in the first place.
Right.
God didn't destroy Solomon's temple because Jerusalem had weak walls. He destroyed it because the people had corrupt hearts, they worshipped idols, and they systemically oppressed the poor and the marginalized among them.
The prophets Isaiah and Amos had condemned this exact socioeconomic exploitation centuries earlier.
Exactly. Nehemiah knows that if he builds a 70-foot-high wall of impenetrable stone, but the community inside that wall is violating the Torah through economic injustice, God himself will tear the wall down again.
Wow. That is a staggering realization. The physical wall is entirely useless without internal covenant fidelity. And that realization bridges us perfectly into how Nehemiah interacts with the broader Old Testament canon. Yeah. Because when we look at the theological framing of this book, we are looking at the terminal phase of the Davidic kingdom.
Right, the final phase.
We have traced this massive historical arc from the miraculous entry into the Promised Land, through the golden age of David and Solomon, into the schism of the northern and southern kingdoms, the long, painful decline, and finally the devastating exile. Nehemiah is the historical conclusion of that arc.
It is the final act of the Old Testament historical drama, but it presents a profound theological tension.
Right, and I struggle with this tension immensely, and I know students do too. We're told this is the continuation of the Davidic covenant, the promise of an everlasting kingdom. But there is no Davidic king on the throne in Nehemiah.
The throne is empty.
Yes, Judah is a tiny, impoverished Persian province ruled by a middle management governor who reports to Artaxerxes. How in the world is this localized administrative project actualizing the grand cosmic promises made to Abraham and David?
It actualizes those promises through the theology of the remnant.
Okay, break that down.
God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12 promised a land, a seed, and a blessing to the nations. His covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7 promised an eternal throne. The Babylonian exile seemingly obliterated all of that.
It looked like total failure.
Right. But Nehemiah demonstrates that God is meticulously, sovereignly managing the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East to ensure that a distinct covenantal community survives in the exact geographic location required for the eventual arrival of the Messiah.
Oh, I see.
The preservation of the remnant in Yehud is the tangible proof that Yahweh's covenant is unconditional and that he never leaves his redemptive work unfinished.
Okay, that makes sense. It is the preservation of the staging ground.
Exactly.
But the community themselves, the people living in this terminal phase, they seem terrified of their own history.
Oh, absolutely terrified.
When you read the great prayer of confession in Nehemiah chapter 9, where they're renewing the covenant, it is essentially a massive intertextual callback to the Pentateuch and the historical books.
Yeah.
How is this community utilizing their past to secure their future?
They are using their canonical history as a mirror to diagnose their present failures and as a blueprint for their future survival.
Right.
In Nehemiah 9, the Levites lead the people in reciting the entire redemptive history of Israel, from the call of Abraham to the Exodus, to the giving of the law at Sinai, to the conquest of the land, and right through the rebellion of the judges and kings.
They lay it all out.
They do. They are publicly acknowledging that God has been completely righteous in all the disasters that have befallen them, and that they have been the ones who acted wickedly.
So they are explicitly repudiating the paradigms of their past that led to exile. They look back at the era of the judges, a time characterized by the phrase, everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
And they are structurally organizing themselves to ensure they never return to that theological confusion.
Exactly. And conversely, they look for positive paradigms to emulate. When they establish their new governance and accountability structures, they are mirroring the commissioned, uncompromising leadership of Joshua during the initial settlement of the land.
Okay, I see the parallel there.
And when they commit to a standard of wholehearted service, they are looking back to figures like Caleb, who fully followed the Lord even when the majority of the spies brought a bad report. They are acutely, painfully aware that their survival depends on learning the lessons of the Torah.
And because they're so hyper-aware of the wrath of God that caused the exile, their entire theology of holiness undergoes a dramatic shift here.
It really does.
Prior to the exile, if you wanted to talk about holiness, you were talking about the temple. Sanctity was heavily concentrated in the Holy of Holies, mediated by the priesthood and physically located on Mount Zion.
Yes.
But in Nehemiah, we see a shift toward a community-led holiness that extends far beyond the temple precincts.
This is one of the most significant biblical theological developments in the post-exilic period. Sanctity begins to encompass the entire covenant community and the physical boundaries of their habitation.
Right.
We see this vividly in Nehemiah 12 during the dedication of the wall. The text says the priests and Levites purified themselves, and then they purified the people, the gates, and the wall itself.
Which is wild. They are treating civil infrastructure with the exact same ritual purity laws that they would apply to the bronze altar.
Precisely. The physical walls of Jerusalem become a theological symbol of necessary separation from the wicked surrounding nations. The perimeter of the city becomes the boundary of the holy community.
So it's expanding outward.
Yes. Holiness is no longer just about what happens on the altar. It is about who is allowed inside the gates and how the community conducts its commerce, its marriages, and its justice system within those boundaries.
Which honestly forces us to address a very uncomfortable question for the modern reader.
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, when we read about Nehemiah demanding strict separation from foreigners. When we read about him violently reacting to intermarriage with pagan women in chapter 13, I mean, he literally pulls out the hair of some of the offenders.
Yeah.
It is jarring.
It's intense.
Does building a literal, physical wall risk isolating the community into a form of xenophobic tribalism? Are we reading a text that is advocating for ethnic purity as a theological ideal?
That is a critical question, especially for those of you preaching this text today. We have to understand the Hebrew concept of badal, which means to separate or divide.
Badal.
Yes, this is a foundational concept in the Torah. In Genesis 1, God separates the light from the darkness, the waters from the dry land. In Leviticus, Israel is commanded to separate the holy from the common, the clean from the unclean.
Right.
So for Nehemiah, separation is not about ethnic superiority or xenophobia. It is entirely about covenantal purity.
Okay, so it's ecclesiastical separation, not racial segregation.
Exactly. Historically, whenever Israel formed unholy alliances or intermarried with the surrounding pagan nations, it inevitably led to religious syncretism.
Right, the foreign spouses brought their foreign gods.
Which led to idolatry, which brought the curse of the covenant and ultimately the exile. So Nehemiah is fiercely protecting the spiritual integrity of the remnant. He knows that preventing the discordant key of rebellion from returning to the community requires severe, tangible boundaries.
It was the absolute prerequisite to prevent the fragile nation from dissolving back into the pagan soup of the ancient Near East.
Exactly right.
And as we discussed with chapter 5, that purity was not merely about keeping the pagans out, it was about keeping justice in.
Yes.
Let's dive deeper into the theology of the covenant document they signed in Nehemiah chapter 10. Because this document codifies the socioeconomic restructuring we saw earlier. Covenantal equity becomes the defining mark of their fidelity to Yahweh.
It does. In chapter 10, the community binds themselves with a curse and an oath to walk in God's law given through Moses. And the specific commitments they make are profoundly practical.
Like what?
Well, they commit to strict Sabbath observance. They pledge not to buy wares or grain from the peoples of the land on the Sabbath day or on a holy day.
So they are intentionally limiting their own economic prosperity to honor the holy time of the Lord.
Exactly.
Which Nehemiah enforces with absolute zeal in chapter 13. When foreign merchants try to camp outside the wall and sell goods on the Sabbath, Nehemiah physically locks the gates of the city and threatens to use force against the merchants if they don't leave. He says, if you do so again, I will lay hands on you.
He was not messing around.
No. He treats Sabbath breaking not just as a personal sin, but as a breach in national security.
Because it is. I mean, the Sabbath breaking was one of the primary reasons Gus gave for the exile to give the land its Sabbaths that the people had ignored. Nehemiah is essentially saying, we are not going back to Babylon so you can make a few extra shekels on a Saturday.
Right.
Furthermore, the covenant document details massive commitments to temple and tithe maintenance. They pledge to bring the first fruits of their ground, their fruit trees, their herds, and their flocks to the house of God. They commit to paying the temple tax to support the continuous burnt offerings.
And they specifically mention bringing the tithes to the Levites. Why is the financial support of the Levites such a central pillar of this new covenantal commitment?
Because the Levites were landless. Under the Mosaic distribution of the land, the tribe of Levi did not receive an agricultural inheritance. Their inheritance was the Lord himself.
Right.
So they were entirely dependent on the tithes of the other tribes to survive. If the community neglected the tithe, which they frequently did, the Levites would be forced to abandon their sacred duties at the temple and go farm in the fields just to feed their families.
Oh, I see.
And if that happened, the sacrificial system would collapse, the teaching of the Torah would cease, and the presence of God would be neglected. So for Nehemiah, economic justice and the financial support of ministry were non-negotiable elements of a holy community.
Okay, let's step back and look at the entire architectural blueprint of this book so far. We have an intense focus on socioeconomic equity. We have the physical preservation of a holy remnant behind giant stone walls. We have a fiercely enforced ecclesiastical separation.
Right.
But all of this logistical and administrative scaffolding isn't just about surviving the Persian era.
Yeah.
It is preparing the stage for something infinitely greater. And that brings us to the Christological focus of the book, the promised seed. Now, I know a lot of preachers struggle here. Prove to me that we aren't just retrofitting Jesus into a book of civil engineering. Where is the redemptive trajectory in Nehemiah?
Well, the trajectory is found in what the walls were built to protect and how the people inside those walls were transformed. To see this, we have to look at the central defining event of the book,
Hmm.
the public reading of the Torah in Nehemiah chapter 8.
Yes, chapter 8.
This is the moment the community transitions from being merely a geographically gathered people to a profoundly scripture-centric people.
Walk us through the mechanics of that scene, because it is one of the most powerful moments in the Old Testament.
It really is. So it is the 7th month, the time of the Feast of Trumpets. The people gather as one man in the square before the Watergate. And notice, they don't ask for a miracle. They don't ask for a prophet to give a new oracle. They ask Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses.
Wow, they initiate it.
They do. Ezra stands on a high wooden platform. He opens the scroll in the sight of all the people, and he reads from it from early morning until midday. And as he reads, the Levites circulate among the people, and the text says they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading.
Right.
The Hebrew word there is mephorash, which implies translating the Hebrew into the common Aramaic and explaining its theological meaning.
It is literally the birth of expository preaching.
Exactly. And the response of the people is just overwhelming. They weep. The public expository reading of the Word of God acts as a devastating mirror, exposing their utter failure and the depths of their sin.
It creates a profound sense of need within the community.
Yes. But Nehemiah and Ezra stop their weeping. They tell them, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." The word not only exposes their sin, it reveals the gracious, covenant-keeping character of God, which becomes the source of their resilience.
So the community's identity is now entirely tethered to the written word. The Torah becomes the foundation of their national life. It becomes the captain of salvation for a people who realize their kings and their judges have all failed them.
And that is the Christological trajectory right there. This intense elevation of the written word in the consciousness of Israel is preparing the remnant for the ultimate fulfillment of redemptive history.
Right.
They are clinging to the written word because it is all they have left. But this intense focus is shaping their theological expectations. It is preparing their hearts and minds to recognize the true and final revelation of God when the word becomes flesh.
John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. The post-exilic community's devotion to the scroll of Moses is the precursor to the church's devotion to the incarnate Christ.
Yes, and furthermore, we must look at the physical walls themselves through a Christological lens.
Okay, let's do that.
Why did God care so deeply about the logistics of timber, the requisition of mortar, and the political wrangling of a Persian cupbearer?
Why?
Because the logistical administrative protection of the inheritance in Judah is the literal historical mechanism God uses to preserve the womb of the virgin.
Wait, let me stop you there and just let that sink in. The walls of Nehemiah protect the womb of Mary.
It is historical cause and effect. Think about it. Without Nehemiah's civil stabilization, without the ruthless enforcement of covenantal boundaries, the fragile Jewish remnant dissolves into the surrounding pagan cultures through intermarriage and syncretism.
Right, they just blend in and disappear.
Exactly. The distinct bloodline of David is lost. The geographic location of Bethlehem, prophesied by Micah as the birthplace of the Messiah, is abandoned to the Edomites or the Arabs.
Wow.
But God's sovereign providence utilizes human administration to secure the redemptive timeline. The walls of Jerusalem were the administrative scaffolding built specifically to protect the arrival of the chief cornerstone.
The Persian bureaucracy, the decrees of Artaxerxes, the late-night inspections of the rubble, the arming of the builders, all of it is marshaled by Yahweh to ensure that centuries later, a virgin named Mary and a carpenter named Joseph will travel to a legally protected, distinctly Jewish province of Judah to give birth to the Son of God.
Yes.
That is the Christological weight of this book. It is breathtaking.
It is the ultimate testament to the fact that God's promises cannot be thwarted by imperial edicts, by economic collapse, or by the rubble of human failure.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most urgent section of our survey: pastoral application and ministry equipment.
Let's get into it.
We have traversed Persian history, Hebrew syntax, and messianic trajectories. But how does this ancient, deeply theological memoir equip a pastor or a lay leader for Monday morning in the local church? Let's talk about the practical equip and inspire takeaways.
I think the most immediate application we must draw is from Nehemiah's uncompromising stance on covenantal equity.
Okay.
Pastors, elders, and church leaders must be willing to confront internal injustice with the exact same zeal they use to defend against external theological threats. It is very easy to build walls against the secular culture, right? To preach against the Sanballats of our day.
Very easy.
It is much harder to stop the building project, convene the assembly, and address deep-seated grievances, socioeconomic exploitation, or systemic neglect happening within your own pews.
I think of the modern equivalence, chapter 5 here. I mean, we may not have literal debt slavery, but we have congregants exploiting one another in business. We have the wealthy in the church given preferential treatment, while the poor, the single mothers, and the marginalized are totally overlooked in the daily distribution.
Right.
Nehemiah teaches us that if we ignore the vulnerable within our walls, our orthodox theology means absolutely nothing.
Orthodoxy must produce orthopraxy.
Right.
Practical care for the weak is not a secondary peripheral social issue. It is a primary matter of covenant faithfulness. If your church is fractured by internal economic or social injustice, your corporate witness to the outside world is nullified.
I would also add a profound pastoral reflection on the scripture-centric identity we see in chapter 8.
Yeah.
If we want to foster genuine multi-generational discipleship, and if we want to comfort suffering believers who feel like they are living in the rubble of a rapidly secularizing post-Christian culture,
Yeah.
the modern church must recover an absolute, unapologetic reliance on the public reading and preaching of the Word.
We must trust the intrinsic power of the text. Nehemiah's community didn't find psychological resilience by looking inward, by seeking mystical experiences, or by adapting their theology to fit Persian cultural norms.
No, they didn't.
They found their resilience by standing for hours under the authority of the Book of the Law. They allowed the Word to wound them, to expose their sin, and then to heal them with the joy of the Lord. In an age of pragmatic church growth strategies and, frankly, entertainment-driven liturgy, we need a massive recovery of Ezra's wooden platform.
Yes, we do.
We need the Word to be central, clear, and authoritative.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. Returning to the metaphor of construction, where we began. Nehemiah's physical walls were a necessary, tangible boundary. They defined a holy community.
Right.
They prevented the disastrous apostasy of the Judges era, and they historically preserved the remnant for the coming of Christ. The walls were not meant to keep the grace of God locked in. They were meant to keep the idolatry of the world out long enough for the Messiah to arrive. So for those of you leading in a pluralistic, highly compromised modern world, what are the spiritual and ecclesiastical walls you are called to build today? We aren't stacking stone and mortar, but we are called to build boundaries of theological orthodoxy, ethical purity, and covenantal accountability.
It's crucial work.
How do you maintain a distinct, unapologetic holiness within your congregation without losing your passion for outward, global gospel proclamation? Are you defining your church's boundaries with the precision and courage of a master builder? Or are you leaving the gates wide open to the syncretism of the age, hoping the rubble will somehow fix itself?
It really is the defining leadership question of our time.
It is. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the sources today.
We hope this rigorous survey equips you to teach, preach, and lead with greater clarity and conviction.
Keep exploring the richness of the Old Testament canon. There's always a deeper foundation beneath the surface waiting to be unearthed.